Well, hey everybody, what's up? Matthew here. Thanks for checking into the YouTube channel. Today we're going to do another free portion of a lecture that I recently gave at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary down in Pittsburgh, where I am an adjunct professor. If you're not familiar with RPTS, it's one of the best places to go to seminary. One of the oldest seminaries in the United States of America, by the way. There's only a few older than that. There is, of course, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. All of those have gone liberal a long time ago. RPTS is the oldest seminary that has held the conservative line. We are still a confessional, Bible-believing seminary there. So if you're looking for a place to go get trained to be a pastor or to acquire some theological knowledge, you can hardly do anything better than RPTS. So check that out on our website, rpts.edu. If you're new to this channel, my name is Matthew. I'm one of the pastors at Gospel Fellowship PCA. That's where I have my day job. I'm a pastor, Gospel Fellowship PCA. We're just north of Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a church like that, Reformed, Bible-believing, Presbyterian, all those good things, come check us out as well. Well, last week, or actually I don't know when I'm going to post these, but recently, let's say, I gave you a free portion of a lecture from my RPTS class on evangelism, in which I talked quite a bit about open air evangelism and encouraged you to do the same. Today, I'm going to give you another free portion of a lecture from my class on evangelism at RPTS. This time, though, we're going to take a historical focus. As a matter of fact, we're going to look at a life of one of the great evangelists in the Reformed tradition. That would be David Brainerd. If you're not familiar with David Brainerd, you should be. His journal is excellent. It's wonderful devotional reading material, and his journal, as a matter of fact, is one of the causes, the prompts, of course, all things by God's sovereignty, but one of the prompts, humanly speaking, of the modern missionary movement. A lot of people read Brainerd's journal, and they were inspired to go out and become evangelists or missionaries themselves. Thus, the reason for me including this as one of the lectures in my evangelism class. Well, with very little fanfare here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift into educational mode here, and let's go through a portion of that lecture together. Again, if you were to come to RPTS, this would be similar to some of the lectures that you might hear. Some people think of the seminary as being exclusively ivory tower type theology that's barely even comprehensible, much less applicable, but that's far from the truth, of course. The goal of seminary is to prepare you for a career in ministry of some kind, or perhaps just to sharpen your faith as a Christian. So a lot of it has to do with practical theology, of course, systematic theology, church history, etc. So in this class, what we're going to do here is we're going to look at a man whose life God greatly used to inspire others in their ministry. So a little bit about David Brainerd, if you're not familiar. David Brainerd comes to us from the 18th century. His dates of life are 1718 through 1747. And he is famous for being a missionary to the Native Americans, or the First Peoples, whatever term you prefer there. He is, of course, the author of the Journal of David Brainerd. Sometimes it's called the Diary of David Brainerd. It's been published in various formats, including paperback, etc., hardbacks. But you can get it for free online if you go to edwards.yale.edu and you just go to the official works of Jonathan Edwards, which are free for everybody to view. And that would be volume 7 if you're interested in looking at that. What I like to do is I like to download that stuff and send it to my Kindle, and then I read it totally for free from there. Now, Brainerd's background is very interesting. He had 9 siblings, and he was orphaned as a young boy. And so I think this is going to affect part of his personal disposition, just as kind of his personality, as any great tragedy would. His father died when he was 46 years old, and his mother died just a few years later, 5 years later. And so he lived with one of his sisters, Jerusha. Now, a little bit of disambiguation there. There's another person called Jerusha that's going to come into the story. Different Jerushas. He has one that's called, that's his sister called Jerusha, and then there's another person, I'll get to her a little bit later, who's kind of important and very intriguing in terms of his life. He studies at Yale. His conversion is 1739, and after his death, which is tragic in its own right, his brother, John Brainerd, is going to carry on his missionary work. All right, so that's a little bit of his background. One of the key things that happened to Brainerd as he was studying, though, is he was expelled from Yale University. Now, let's set ourselves here in the context of the Great Awakening. So we're thinking primarily of 1740s, early 40s. I like to think of the Great Awakening as 1740 to 42. That's kind of the epicenter of the event. The awakening is moving through the seminary, and as it was through the rest of the colonies. And Brainerd makes an incautious comment, unfortunately. Sometimes when people are swept up into a religious fervor or zeal, they speak a little bit out of tune. And he said something about one of the tutors there at Yale. He said that this particular individual, Rector Clapp, did not have as much grace as a chair. And though he said that comment privately, his remarks became known to the administration of the seminary, the university, and they expelled him. And no matter what he could do to try to get himself reinstated, he even had some people trying to help him to get reinstated, yet nevertheless it did not avail. And so this became a great disappointment to him, especially in as much as he really wanted to be a pastor. Okay, so eventually he's going to be a missionary or an evangelist, but he first thought about being a pastor. The problem was, though, at this time it was very difficult to be ordained to be a pastor in a local church in this particular setting. Of course, we're pre-1776, we're pre-Revolutionary War. We're talking about the colonial era. It was hard to become ordained if you did not have a degree from either Harvard or Yale. Princeton's going to emerge just a little bit later, or at least a degree from one of the European seminaries, which would have been considered probably the best possible education at that time. Without that, then it would be very difficult to be able to go into pastoral ministry. And so David Brainerd finds himself between a rock on one hand and the hard place on the other, that he desperately wants to be useful to God in terms of ministry, but now he can't because he's been expelled, and every route of trying to get himself reinstated has not worked. So what this brings David Brainerd to is a position of great dejection and even what we might call today depression. Now, I'm not some kind of a psychologist or psychiatrist or anything like that, but when you read through David Brainerd's journals, it does become readily obvious that he is definitely struggling with his mental or his emotional health. Just the number of times that he writes about his utter dejection. I should tell you, too, that Jonathan Edwards actually is the editor of David Brainerd's journals. Now, we may say more about that as we go through this material here, but Edwards has to work through David Brainerd's journals, and he has to try to call out some of the material because it does get very dark in certain places. Here's a sample entry from January 14th. Spent this day under a great degree of bodily weakness and disorder, and had very little freedom, either in my studies or devotions, and this evening I was much dejected and melancholy. It pains and distresses me that I live so much of my time for nothing. I long to do much in a little time, and if it might be the Lord's will to finish my work speedily in this tiresome world. So that's kind of a sample of the blue that's what I call it when I go through things like this. I just call it a blue stage or a blue day. Whatever other labels we might put on that, certainly he was struggling. And of course, his expulsion from Yale is figuring heavily in this. He thinks he wants to do a work for the Lord, and now he finds that door is shut every single way he tries to turn the knob. Now, I should mention at this point his relationship to Jonathan Edwards, because it is very significant in his life. Edwards is something of a mentor for David Brainerd, but it's sort of a mutual admiration society in one sense. Edwards is going to admire David Brainerd's zeal, especially as he's willing to suffer for the cause of the mission, which we're going to see more of here as we proceed through our material. And there's no doubt, too, that David Brainerd thought of Jonathan Edwards as a theological mentor in his life. Now, here's where we have to talk about the other Jerusha, because Jonathan Edwards likewise has a person in his life called Jerusha. It's his daughter. And Jerusha is the flower of the family. Edwards has a lot of children, but all things considered, Jerusha is the lively, sprightly, delightful personality. She's very spiritual. She's wonderful to be around. And it seems as though later on in David Brainerd's life, he has a connection with Jerusha. We're not sure if it's love, but it certainly looks like that. As David Brainerd eventually becomes sick and finally dies, it was Jerusha who was by him in his time of physical suffering through his tuberculosis. And eventually, they're going to be buried next to each other as Jerusha is going to die as well. So not only is Jonathan Edwards the mentor of David Brainerd, you know, some people think, and I'm inclined to think this way, he could have possibly been his father-in-law if health had not intervened and David Brainerd had not got sick unto death. Either way, though, Jonathan Edwards is going to be the eulogist for David Brainerd. He's going to preach a wonderful sermon at Brainerd's funeral called True Saints When Absent from the Body Are Present with the Lord. And of course, Edwards is ultimately going to serve as the editor of David Brainerd's journals. Now, let's talk a little bit more about David Brainerd's mission and what he did do. He wasn't really able to become a local church pastor as he thought about being, but nevertheless, he did have a marvelous and even remarkable career as an evangelist or a missionary, which is why we're studying him in this particular course, our evangelism course here at RPTS. So he has to sort of change routes. God closes one door for him, and Brainerd has to move into another way of serving the Lord. And so he ends up taking what we might call today a call to become a missionary or an evangelist, especially to the Native Americans. Now, here he finally receives what we might call a license or an ordination or an official approval by the Society in Scotland for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. Even though the doors of higher education closed to him, Brainerd did seem to have some influential persons in high places, including Jonathan Edwards, amongst others. And so he is finally licensed then to preach. And even the Presbytery of New York, which is a New Light Presbytery, gives him essentially their approval to go out and to be an evangelist. Now, during the time of the Awakening, of course, this is highly controversial. Some churches and presbyteries are in favor of the Awakening. We call that the New Light churches or presbyteries, and others were opposed to it. We call those the Old Light churches or presbyteries. The Presbytery of New York finds favor in the New Light camp, and since Brainerd is a New Light revivalist, he is able to garner their endorsement and their approval. He also has a very influential patron called Ebenezer Pemberton, who helps him to make these connections not only in the presbytery, but also in the Society of Scotland for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. Today, we might call that a missions board or something like that, okay? So David Brainerd serves as a missionary evangelist, honestly, for a rather short window of time. So the time in which he is able to do his most fruitful ministry is 1743 through 1747, where he's going to die. And Brainerd is going to serve the Native Americans, or the Indians, we'll just call them that colloquially, in 3 different settings. So he serves in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, also Bethlehem, Pennsylvania for a time, and then Cross-Weeksung, New Jersey in 1745 to 1746, where he's ultimately going to have his best, most fruitful labor. And it's there, in that latter place, where Brainerd's missionary enterprise is finally successful, and he's able to lead some 130 persons to the Lord. He has 130 converts in his life, which you may not think is a great number, but I think is a fantastic harvest. And certainly he suffered in order to bring the people the gospel. Now let's just have a look here at the map, and let me move my face over this way so you can see Stockbridge. You can see its relationship to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and then Cross-Weeksung in New Jersey over here. Moving my face back, you can see over on this side of the map where we are, the RPTS campus is, and where Gospel Fellowship is. So this is sort of local to us, not necessarily so. All right, so moving on. One of the reasons why Brainerd's journal becomes so devotional and motivating to those who went into missions and foreign evangelism enterprises after his life is because of the deep, powerful prayers that Brainerd prays. So, for instance, listen to this entry. All right, he says, was able to spend a considerable part of the day in prayer and close studies, had more freedom and fervency in prayer than usual of late, especially longed for the presence of God in my work, that the poor heathen might be converted. And in evening prayer, my faith and hope in God were much raised. To an eye of reason, everything that respects the conversion of the heathen is as dark as midnight, and yet I cannot but hope in God for the accomplishment of something glorious among them. My soul longed for the advancement of the Redeemer's kingdom on earth, was very fearful lest I should admit some vain thought, and so lose the sense I had then of divine things. Oh, for an abiding heavenly temper. Now, when people read entries like this in Brainerd's journal, there's no wonder why they are likewise motivated to redouble their own prayer life, to go to the Lord and ask for conversions, to plead with God to do a great work in their church or in their nation. No wonder people love the diary of David Brainerd. Not only is he suffering in cold, not only is he riding on horseback alone, not only is he camping out alone at night in the forests, he's going through all of these physical extremes and hardships which are described in his journal, but all of the time his heart is on fire for the Lord and just longing for the conversion to Christ of the Native American people that he's trying to serve here. So yes, it is richly devotional reading material here. Here's another sample prayer from his journal. Lord's Day, April 25th. This morning spent about 2 hours in secret duties and was enabled more than ordinary to agonize for immortal souls. Though it was early in the morning and the sun scarcely shined at all, yet my body was quite wet with sweat. Felt much pressed now as frequently of late to plead for the meekness and calmness of the Lamb of God. I just love this language here, don't you? Through divine goodness felt much of it this morning. Oh, 'tis a sweet disposition heartily to forgive all injuries done to us, to wish our greatest enemies as well as we might do our own souls. Blessed Jesus, may I daily be more and more conformed to thee. These are the kinds of rich prayers that he is praying throughout his journals. Here's another one, his dying passion for conversion of souls. This is Thursday, July 24th. Rode about 17 miles westward over a hideous mountain to a number of Indians, got together nearly 30 of them, preached to them in the evening, lodged among them, was weak and felt something disconsolate, yet could have no freedom in the thought of any other circumstances or business in life. All my desire was the conversion of the heathen. All of my hope was in God. God does not suffer me to please or comfort myself with hopes of seeing friends or returning to my dear acquaintances and enjoying worldly comforts. No. So he's saying, like, look, yes, of course I would love a good, hearty conversation with my friends or my family or the comforts of just being in home in my nice warm bed. But he would prefer rather to suffer all of the discomforts of the missionary life. Again, through the winters, through the forests, in the rain, riding on horseback, so that he has the opportunity to preach the gospel to some people who would be willing to hear it. Now, finally, he has his spiritual breakthrough. And this is a great moment for Brainerd. Let me read this quote to you as well. August 15, 1745, preached from Luke 4. The word was attended with power upon the hearts of the hearers. There was much concern, many tears, affecting cries among them, and some in a special manner were deeply wounded and distressed for their souls. There were some newly awakened who came about this week, and convictions seemed to be promoted in others. Those that had received comfort were likewise refreshed and strengthened, and the work of grace appeared to advance in all respects. The passions of the congregation in general were not so much moved as in some days past, but their hearts seemed as solemnly and deeply affected with divine truths as ever, at least in many instances. And although the concern did not seem to be so universal and to reach every individual in such a manner as it had appeared to do some days before. Okay, so there is his breakthrough here as the people are really beginning to get it. The Spirit of God is clearly beginning to move amongst the people, and conversions are soon to follow here. Here's one more. Again, I'll kind of remove my face so you can read this here. April 6th, 1742, then I cried to God to wash my soul, cleanse me from exceeding filthiness, give me repentance and pardon, as it began to be something sweet to pray, and I could think of undergoing the greatest sufferings for the cause of Christ. With pleasure, found myself willing, if God should so order it, to suffer banishment from my native land among the heathen, that I might do something for their soul salvation in distress and death of any kind. Then God gave me to wrestle earnestly for others, for the kingdom of Christ in the world, and for dear Christians. I felt weaned from the world. Have you ever felt that in your whole life, right? I felt weaned from the world and from my own reputation amongst men, willing to be despised, to be a gazing stock for the world to behold. 'Tis impossible for me to express how I then felt. I had not much joy, but some sense of the majesty of God, which made me, as it were, tremble. I saw myself mean and vile, which made me more willing that God should do what he could with me, if it was all infinitely reasonable. All right, so there you go here. Powerful stuff from David Brainerd. Now let's talk about his unfortunate death. So what happens to him as he's suffering through all of these hardships is he begins to notice there's something wrong with his body. He is spitting up blood. He is coughing more than usual. Sometimes he coughs up not only blood, but some pus as well, diarrhea unceasing. And so what he begins to realize is that he has contracted today what we call tuberculosis. Of course, it was exacerbated by the extreme conditions of the cold winters and the loneliness and the desperations. And here's where his relationship with Jerusha Edwards, Jonathan's daughter, becomes so precious, because even in his great sickness, he comes to Jonathan Edwards' home, right? And he stays there, and eventually he dies even in Jonathan Edwards' own home in 1747. And this is where Edwards goes on to preach true saints, when absent from the body, are present with the Lord. Now, in those days, unfortunately, they did not understand as much today as we do today about contagious diseases. And so Jerusha, Jonathan Edwards' daughter, who's caring for him, who's by his bedside, who's putting cold compresses on his forehead and changing his bedpans, right? She ends up contracting the same disease and dies shortly thereafter. It's a really tragic story. And then they are buried eventually either next to each other or in the same grave. There's a little bit of wondering there which exactly it is. Either way, the implication seems to be that Jerusha might have fallen in love with David Brainerd even as he's dying in the Edwards' home. She herself gets sick and then dies as well. Okay, so what happens with Brainerd then is that his journal ends up having more impact than even his own life as a missionary does, hard as it is to believe, because he ends up doing, by God's grace, quite a wonderful work amongst the Native Americans. But the journal, which he is kind of writing out, is going to be given not only to Edwards, or not only to his brother, but then Edwards writes his brother saying, "Is there any more of this journal? I want to get my hands on it." Edwards then takes it and he edits it. He restyles it at some points. He does have to cut out some of the blue sections, which are pretty depressing to read through. And this becomes actually Jonathan Edwards' most successful publishing endeavor, at least in his own life. This is the book that sold more than any other book that Jonathan Edwards ever wrote, and it has been reprinted and reprinted and reprinted. Sometimes Edwards would have to remove some of the theological idiosyncrasies that Brainerd may have. Edwards wants to present him something as a model saint. Edwards has been talking all this time about what truly the religious affections are, the distinguishing marks of a work of grace, etc. And he wants to paint Brainerd as the example of the person whose heart is truly converted and is willing to suffer anything, and yet has the real joy of the presence of the Lord. Okay, so it does become something that's really, really powerful to read. And not only that, but Brainerd's journal is that which is read by all of these persons here on the screen, motivating them to serve in some way, either in pastoral work or in missions or in evangelism more broadly. So Gideon Hawley takes it with him and his missionary work. John Wesley is reading this. Later on, we have names like Robert Murray McShane, who's reading Brainerd. Francis Asbury, if you're Methodist, you may know that name. William Carey, William Henry Martin, David Livingston, some of the great missionaries of all time. Andrew Murray, and then even more recently, Jim Elliot from the 1950s is another person who read Brainerd's journal and was just incredibly moved by what they read therein. All right. So that is an example of a life lived as a wonderful evangelist. And in that way, I think it's still worth it to go to read Brainerd's journal. Now, again, you can get it for free on edwards.yale.edu. If you just go to volume 7, you can download it or print it or whatever you want to do. I'm also going to post a link in the description of this video of a paperback edition of this. Just so you might want to read it. If you might want a nice print copy of it, I'll hook you up with one of those. And by the way, if you've been admiring my Confessional 1646 Presbyterian T-shirt as you're watching this, I will also post a link to that as well. Don't forget, give us a look at rpts.edu if you're interested in perhaps going to a Reformed, conservative, biblical, confessional seminary. I think we're the best out there. Of course, my opinion is a little bit biased, but I think it's great. Anyway, thanks for checking in. I do love you lots. Talk to you later.